A rancher noticed her horse scratching at the same barn wall every single day. When she finally broke through, what she found changed everything she thought she knew about her family's land. Elena Castellanos had inherited a quiet ranch in the New Mexico high desert, but her mare, Sahara, wouldn't stop pawing at the east wall of the old equipment barn. At first, Elena ignored it. Horses had their quirks. But after 3 weeks of the same obsessive behavior, always the same spot, always with the same frantic energy, she grabbed a sledgehammer and decided to find out why. What came tumbling out from behind those rotted planks would unravel a secret buried for 40 years and put her life in danger from people who thought the past was safely hidden. Elena Castellanos stood in the doorway of the equipment barn, her morning coffee steaming in the cool pre-dawn air, watching Sahara do it again. The Palomino mare pressed her velvet nose against the east wall, scraped her front hoof along the weathered baseboards with methodical precision, then backed up 3 steps and snorted, a sound of pure frustration that seemed almost human in its clarity. Same wall, same spot, same ritual. 26 days in a row now, without deviation. Elena had owned Sahara for 8 years, ever since pulling the emaciated yearling from a livestock auction where she'd been destined for slaughter. In all that time, the mare had been steady, intuitive, remarkably intelligent for a horse. She learned quickly, trusted deeply, and had never shown a moment of obsessive behavior. Not once. This was different. This was deliberate. This was a horse trying to communicate something she couldn't say with words. Elena set her coffee mug on an overturned bucket and walked across the packed dirt floor, her boots echoing in the cavernous space. The barn had been built sometime in the late 1940s by her grandfather, Mateo Castellanos, back when this stretch of New Mexico borderland still held promise. Back before the aquifer started failing, before the interstate bypassed the county entirely, before ranching became less about prosperity and more about sheer stubborn refusal to admit defeat. The building was purely functional. No charm, no architectural flourishes. Just walls to keep equipment dry and a roof to block the relentless desert sun. But it had lasted. 75 years of punishing heat and bitter winter winds, and the structure still stood solid. Mostly solid, anyway. Elena ran her palm along the planks where Sahara had been scratching. The wood was sun-bleached to the color of old bone, the grain raised and rough from decades of weather. Nothing looked obviously wrong. No cracks, no obvious damage, no signs of rot or insect infestation. Just old timber doing what old timber does, aging slowly, holding on. But Sahara wouldn't leave it alone. The mare pushed her broad forehead against Elena's shoulder, then returned immediately to the wall, pawing with renewed insistence. Her ears were pinned forward, muscles tense beneath her golden coat, every line of her body radiating urgency. "What is it, girl?" Elena murmured. "What are you trying to show me?" Sahara stamped her hoof twice against the baseboard, sharp, emphatic strikes that sounded like knocking. Elena crouched down and rapped her knuckles against the wood where the mare had been pawing. The sound that echoed back made her freeze. Hollow. Distinctly, unmistakably hollow. She knocked again, moving her hand 6 inches to the right. Solid thud. 6 inches left of the original spot. Solid thud. But directly where Sahara had been scratching, the sound was empty, suggesting space behind the boards where there should only be packed earth and foundation stones. Elena stood slowly, her heart beginning to beat faster. She walked outside, circling the barn's perimeter, counting her strides and calculating dimensions the way her father had taught her when she was young. 32 paces along the east wall. She went back inside and paced it again from the interior. 28 paces. 4 paces short. Roughly 12 feet of space that existed on the outside, but not on the inside. 12 feet of barn that had been sealed off, hidden behind a false wall, and forgotten, or deliberately concealed, for decades. Elena returned to where Sahara stood waiting, the mare's dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was almost unsettling. She placed both palms flat against the boards and pushed. The wood flexed inward slightly, moving more than properly anchored planks should. These boards weren't part of the original structure. They'd been added later, fitted into place to create the illusion of a solid wall. Her grandfather had built this barn. Her grandfather had created this hidden space. The question was why. Elena walked to her truck, parked just outside the barn doors, and retrieved a crowbar from the toolbox mounted in the bed. When she returned, Sahara had moved back several yards, standing perfectly still, watching with the focused attention of a creature that knows something important is about to happen. Elena wedged the crowbar's flat end into the seam between two boards and leaned her weight against it. The wood resisted at first, then gave with a groaning screech as decades-old nails tore free from their anchors. Dust exploded outward in a choking cloud, forcing her to turn her face away and cough. The smell that followed made her eyes water. Stale, trapped air that hadn't circulated since before she was born, mixed with something else. Something metallic and faintly chemical that made her stomach clench with instinctive unease. She pried away another board, then another. The gap widened into an opening about 18 inches across, revealing darkness beyond. Elena pulled her phone from her pocket and activated the flashlight, aiming the beam through the hole she'd created. The space was much larger than 12 feet, much deeper. The light revealed a narrow corridor running the entire length of the barn, at least 60 feet, completely hidden behind the false wall. The floor was bare earth, packed hard and level from years of settling. And along that floor, stacked in neat, organized rows like inventory in a warehouse, were wooden crates. Dozens of them, maybe more than 100. Elena's mouth went dry. She pulled away 2 more boards, creating an opening just wide enough to squeeze through sideways. The air that breathed out was cold despite the gathering heat of the New Mexico morning, and that wrong smell intensified: old canvas, gun oil, and something that burned the back of her throat. She turned sideways and pushed through the gap, her boots dropping down into the hidden corridor. It was at least 3 degrees cooler in here, the temperature dropping as if she'd stepped into a cave rather than just behind a wall. Her phone's light carved a white tunnel through the darkness, illuminating row after row of crates stacked 3 high. Elena approached the nearest one and brushed away the thick layer of dust coating its surface. Stenciled letters emerged, faded but still legible in military standard block print. Property of U.S. Army. White Sands Proving Ground. Las Cruces, New Mexico. 1951. Elena's grandfather had been a rancher his entire adult life. He'd never served in the military. A farming exemption had kept him stateside during World War II. He'd never worked for the government, never had any connection to White Sands or any military installation that she knew of. So why was United States Army property hidden behind a false wall in his barn? Her hands were shaking as she gripped the edge of the crate and pulled upward. The lid was nailed shut, but 7 decades had weakened the wood enough that she could work her fingers under the edge and pry. The nails shrieked as they came free, the sound painfully loud in the enclosed space. Inside, wrapped in oil-stained canvas cloth, were rifles. Military rifles, preserved in thick grease that had protected them from rust and decay. She counted 12 in this crate alone, their wooden stocks still solid, their metal components gleaming dully in her phone's light. Elena moved to the next crate, her heart hammering against her ribs. More weapons. These looked like pistols. The crate beside it held ammunition, thousands of rounds in small cardboard boxes marked with military designation codes and dates from 1951 and 1952. She walked deeper into the corridor, her light sweeping across crate after crate. Some were marked with equipment designations she didn't understand. Others bore shipping labels from military installations she'd never heard of. All of them dated from the early 1950s. All of them stamped with official government seals. This wasn't some small-time theft. This wasn't a few pieces of surplus equipment someone had bought at auction and forgotten about. This was systematic. This was organized. This was a cache of stolen military property so extensive it would have required planning, transportation, storage, and most importantly, inside help. Her grandfather couldn't have done this alone. Someone at White Sands had been involved. Someone with access, with authority, with the ability to move large quantities of material off base without triggering alarms. Sahara's whinny drifted in from outside, nervous and questioning. Elena paused, suddenly aware of how isolated she was, how vulnerable, standing in a hidden corridor that no one knew existed, surrounded by evidence of crimes committed before she was born. And then her light caught something else at the far end of the corridor, past all the weapon crates. A metal strongbox, smaller than the military crates, sitting by itself against the back wall, as if it had been placed there separately, deliberately, long after the weapons had been stashed. Elena walked toward it, moving carefully between the rows of crates, her phone's light creating strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. The strongbox was civilian-made, not military issue. A heavy steel container about the size of a small footlocker, with a combination lock that had rusted solid decades ago. She knelt beside it, setting her phone on the ground so the light angled upward. Taped to the top of the box, protected inside a sealed plastic bag that had yellowed with age, was an envelope. The handwriting on the front was shaky and uneven, written by someone whose hands had trembled, from age, from illness, or from fear. To whoever finds this, I never wanted this. They said they would kill my daughters if I didn't help. They said my family would disappear and no one would ever find the bodies. I had no choice. I pray God forgives me. Mateo Castellanos, December 1985. Elena's vision blurred. That was her grandfather's handwriting. She recognized it from old birthday cards and Christmas letters he'd written when she was a child. But she'd never seen it look like this. Desperate, broken, the words of a man carrying unbearable weight. Mateo Castellanos had died in 1987, when Elena was only 6 years old. She remembered him as quiet, distant, a man who seemed permanently sad in a way she hadn't understood as a child. Her mother had always said he'd had a hard life, that the ranch had taken everything from him, that some men just carried darkness they couldn't shake. Now Elena understood. It wasn't the ranch that had broken him. It was this. It was the secret he'd carried for over 30 years, the crime he'd been forced to participate in, the threats against his daughters, Elena's mother and aunt, that had kept him silent even as the guilt consumed him. She picked up the envelope with trembling hands. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a letter, written in the same shaking hand, dated December 14, 1985, less than 2 years before her grandfather died. The letter was 4 pages long, dense with cramped handwriting that filled every available space, as if he'd been desperate to get everything down before time ran out. Elena began to read by the light of her phone. If you're reading this, then I'm dead, and you've found what I helped hide. I need you to know I never wanted any part of this. I was a good man. I tried to be a good man. In 1951, I was approached by a man named Vernon Blackwell. He was an officer at White Sands, in charge of weapons inventory. He told me he needed storage space off base, somewhere remote, somewhere no one would look. He said it was temporary, just until he could arrange proper transport. He offered me $500. I said no. $500 was a fortune back then, but I wasn't a thief. I told him to leave my property. 2 weeks later, my oldest daughter, your mother, was followed home from school. A man in a black car drove behind her the entire way, never closer than 50 feet, never losing sight of her. The next day, my youngest daughter was approached in town. A stranger told her she had pretty hair and asked if she liked candy. Then he walked away. That night, Vernon Blackwell came back. He didn't offer money this time. He told me that accidents happen to children, that little girls go missing and are never found, that the desert is big and bodies are small, and no one would ever know where to look. I built the false wall the next week. For 3 years, weapons and equipment arrived in the middle of the night. Military trucks would pull up after midnight, and men would unload crates, and I would help them stack everything in that hidden corridor. I never asked questions. I kept my mouth shut. I watched my daughters grow up alive and safe, and I told myself that was all that mattered. In 1954, it stopped. Vernon Blackwell came one last time and told me the arrangement was over. He said if I ever spoke about what happened, my family would pay the price. Then he disappeared. I heard later he'd been transferred to Fort Bliss in Texas, then to somewhere overseas. I never saw him again. But the weapons stayed, and the guilt stayed. And every day for 33 years, I've walked past that barn knowing what's hidden inside, knowing I helped steal from my own country, knowing I was too much of a coward to go to the authorities. I'm dying now. Cancer. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. Part of me is relieved. Part of me thinks I deserve worse. If you found this, please do what I couldn't. Go to the federal marshals. Tell them everything. Give them this letter. Let them recover what was stolen. And please, whoever you are, understand that I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just need someone to know that I didn't do this because I was greedy or evil. I did it because I was afraid, and fear makes men do terrible things. The letter ended there, the final words trailing off as if her grandfather had been too exhausted or too ashamed to write another word. Elena sat in the cold darkness of the hidden corridor, her grandfather's confession trembling in her hands, tears streaming down her face. Sahara whinnied again from outside, more urgent this time. And in the distance, barely audible, Elena heard the sound of a vehicle approaching down the long dirt road that led to her ranch. A vehicle she wasn't expecting, a visitor she hadn't invited. She clicked off her phone's light and sat very still in the darkness, surrounded by stolen weapons and the ghost of her grandfather's shame, and wondered if Vernon Blackwell, or someone who knew what Vernon Blackwell had done, had been watching this barn for 40 years, waiting to see if anyone would ever break through that wall, waiting to make sure the secret stayed buried. 6 weeks before Elena Castellanos discovered the hidden corridor in her grandfather's barn, she sat at her kitchen table sorting through bills she couldn't pay, trying to decide which creditors could wait another month and which ones would start foreclosure proceedings if she delayed any longer. The ranch was dying, had been dying for years, really, but Elena had been too stubborn, or too sentimental, to admit it. 320 acres of high desert scrubland that her grandfather had worked, that her father had worked, and that she'd inherited when her father died of a heart attack 3 years ago. 320 acres that were supposed to be her legacy, her connection to family, her proof that the Castellanos bloodline had meant something in this corner of New Mexico. Instead, it was slowly crushing her under debt she'd never be able to climb out from under. Elena pushed the calculator aside and pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting the exhaustion that lived in her bones now. She was 42 years old, had worked as a large animal veterinarian for 18 years, and every cent she earned went straight back into keeping this ranch operational. The cattle herd had dwindled to 37 head, barely enough to justify calling it a working ranch. The equipment was ancient, held together with replacement parts scavenged from junkyards and her own increasingly creative welding repairs. She had $847 in her checking account. The mortgage payment due in 12 days was $1,340. The math was simple and brutal. The veterinary practice helped. She made decent money treating horses and cattle for the handful of ranchers still operating in the county. But it wasn't enough. It had never been enough. Every month was a careful balancing act of which emergency got addressed first, which disaster could be safely ignored for another few weeks. Last month, it had been the truck transmission. The month before, a fence section had collapsed and she'd lost 2 days rounding up scattered cattle. Before that, Sahara had needed emergency colic surgery that cost $3,200 Elena didn't have, so she'd put it on a credit card that was already dangerously close to maxed out. She loved the mare too much to let her die. Would have sold the ranch before letting that horse suffer. Some people thought that was crazy, choosing an animal over property, over financial security. Those people had never been saved by a horse the way Elena had. 8 years ago, when her marriage had collapsed and she'd been drinking too much and spending too many nights staring at her father's old revolver wondering if anyone would really miss her, she'd gone to that livestock auction on impulse. Hadn't planned to buy anything. Had just needed to be somewhere that wasn't her empty house. Sahara had been in the kill pen, a skeletal yearling with dull eyes and visible ribs, destined for slaughter because she was too thin and too wild for anyone to want. Elena had looked at that horse and seen herself, had seen something that was giving up, that had stopped fighting, that was just waiting for the end. She'd bought Sahara for $150, brought her home, nursed her back to health, spent months earning her trust. And somewhere in that process of saving the horse, Elena had saved herself, had found a reason to get out of bed, to stop drinking, to put the revolver back in the safe, and actually lock it this time. But now, standing in that hidden corridor with her grandfather's confession in her hands and the sound of an approaching vehicle growing louder, Elena realized that maybe, just maybe, Sahara had one more way to save her. Elena quickly folded her grandfather's letter and stuffed it in her jacket pocket, then squeezed back through the opening in the false wall. Her heart was hammering as she emerged into the main barn, Sahara immediately pressing close to her side. Through the open barn doors, she could see a dark SUV pulling up the long dirt driveway. The vehicle was expensive, too expensive for this part of New Mexico. Elena's veterinary instincts kicked in, the same calm assessment she used when approaching a spooked horse. Don't panic. Evaluate the threat. Plan your response. She walked out of the barn slowly, deliberately, one hand resting on Sahara's neck. The mare's presence was steadying, grounding. The SUV stopped about 20 yards from the barn. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, late 50s, silver hair cut short, wearing dark slacks and a blazer despite the heat. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Dr. Castellanos?" the woman called out. Elena nodded slowly. "That's me. Can I help you?" The woman reached into her jacket and pulled out a badge case, flipping it open to reveal federal identification. "Special Agent Victoria Brennan, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'd like to talk to you about your grandfather's property." Elena's blood ran cold. The FBI. They already knew. Agent Brennan raised her hands in a placating gesture. "You're not in trouble, Dr. Castellanos. We've had this property under periodic surveillance for nearly 40 years. When our monitoring equipment registered significant activity in the barn this morning, we knew it was time to make contact." "You've been watching?" Elena's voice came out harder than she intended. "For 40 years, you've known those weapons were hidden in my grandfather's barn, and you've done nothing? Can we talk inside?" Brennan asked. "What I have to tell you is going to take some time." Inside Elena's kitchen, Agent Brennan laid out the truth. In 1951, a major named Vernon Blackwell was running weapons inventory at White Sands Proving Ground. He was also running an illegal arms smuggling operation. Your grandfather's ranch was remote, accessible, perfect for storage. When Mateo refused to cooperate, Blackwell threatened his daughters, your mother and aunt. Made it very clear what would happen to them if Mateo didn't help. Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes. So my grandfather wasn't a criminal. He was a victim. He was a father protecting his children the only way he could, Brennan said quietly. By 1954, Blackwell fled. But the weapons he'd stashed at your grandfather's ranch were never recovered. The investigation was quietly buried because too many powerful people were implicated. But you knew they were here. A small group within the FBI knew. We've maintained surveillance, waiting. We couldn't seize the weapons without reopening the investigation, which would have exposed government complicity. It was deemed politically untenable. Elena stared at her. "So you just left them here? Left my grandfather to carry that guilt until it killed him?" Brennan didn't flinch. "You're right. It was wrong. But the political landscape has changed. There's finally space to make it right." She leaned forward. "Dr. Castellanos, I want to offer you a deal. You cooperate with our recovery of the weapons. You provide your grandfather's letter as evidence. In exchange, the Department of Justice will formally acknowledge that Mateo Castellanos acted under duress. He'll be cleared of any wrongdoing. And the federal government will pay you fair compensation for the use of your property, approximately $2.3 million. Elena's breath caught. Enough to save the ranch. Enough to breathe. What's the catch? The case stays sealed for national security reasons. You can't talk publicly about government complicity. Your grandfather's name stays protected. You get compensated. We recover the weapons." Elena looked at Sahara, still standing in the doorway. The mare who had spent 26 days trying to tell her something was wrong. "I want it in writing," Elena said finally. Brennan pulled a folder from her briefcase. "Already prepared." Elena signed. 3 months later, Elena stood on her newly repaired front porch, watching the sun set over land that finally, truly belonged to her. The mortgage was paid off. The roof was fixed. She'd hired ranch hands. Purchased new cattle. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. Sahara wandered over from the pasture. Elena produced a carrot, which the mare accepted with dignified pleasure. "You knew something was wrong," Elena said to the horse. "You knew it needed to be found. And you wouldn't let it go until I listened." The mare finished her carrot and rested her head against Elena's shoulder. They stood there together as the sun dropped below the horizon. The ranch spread out around them, no longer a burden, but simply home. A place where truth had been buried and then unearthed. Where injustice had been hidden and then acknowledged. And where a horse who'd once been destined for slaughter had saved her owner's life twice. First by giving her a reason to live, and then by refusing to let the past stay buried. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more incredible tales. Thank you for watching.